Welcome to Macon Memories. This is Lynda Wright at Randolph-Macon College. Today is June 28th, 2013, and I'm here today with David Meyer, class of 1974. David, welcome. Tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, went to high school, and how you happened to come to Randolph-Macon.
Well, I was born in Virginia, in Northern Virginia, actually in Arlington, in 1951, December of 1951, and my parents were originally from the Midwest and came to Washington just before the war as single persons working for the federal government, and then when the war began, my father went into active duty, and my mother followed him to the naval base in Chicago, and then and they got married 2 months after Pearl Harbor in Washington, and then went to Chicago, and he worked in training, sold Navy people during the war at this naval base, and then came back to Washington after the war and began his career working in the Defense Department. So my parents moved to Virginia, first in Fairlington in 1946, and immediately started having a family. I'm the youngest of three, and one of the formative influences in my family's life growing up was their involvement in church life as a big part of our family life, and they were active Methodists, and hence the connection with Randolph-Macon in the future. I grew up in Vienna, Virginia. They moved out to Fairfax County and attended the elementary school there in Vienna and middle school, as well as James Madison High School. Graduated in 1970. Those were interesting times in some ways. My experience growing up was somewhat typical of a boomer generation. We were very fortunate to live in a community that was very family focused. When I was growing up, we had I had a number of teachers in high school who were Randolph-Macon graduates, as well as several of the ministers who served our local church that my family attended went to Randolph-Macon. So I had a sister who attended Ferrum College, an older sister, and so it was somewhat natural for me to consider Randolph-Macon as an option, and I was accepted at several schools, some large and some small, here in Virginia, and Randolph-Macon was my first choice. Now, I will say that growing up in Virginia during that time, I went to public schools, and those schools were segregated until the 7th grade. And in 1964, Fairfax County began a very intentional integration of all the schools. There were some attempts to integrate the schools on a pilot basis before that time, but this was the full-scale implementation of the integration of the schools.
What do you remember about that specifically? 7th grade, full scale. Describe what you mean by that and how that impacted you.
Well, in some ways, the community I lived in was typical of the South in the sense that there were pockets of African American homes and certain streets, but the connection and interaction between that community and the white community was very limited. And in fact, my father was a Little League coach in 1963, and our team had the first integrated team of any team in the town of Vienna. And I didn't think much about it at the time. You know, when you're a young person, when change is happening around you, you're also changing too. So some of the changes are really significant, but and some are incidental, and you take it all in stride every day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, I was keenly aware of that there were some parents of friends who expressed some pretty racist views, and that was not something that I experienced in my own family life, and so I found that disconcerting and troubling to me. I can remember as a 12 or 13-year-old being very uncomfortable with that and not liking that.
So when you came to Randolph-Macon, you came from a high school that was was significantly integrated.
Yes, it was.
And then when you came to Randolph-Macon, you came to pretty much for an all-white situation. Now, Randolph-Macon had very, very few African-American students when you came. The first black student was Hap Payne in 1966, graduating in 68. And Dennis Howard was here when you came.
Correct.
He came in the fall of 68. And I think you had 3 or 4 classmates, African-American classmates. But talk about, did that just feel natural as Randolph-Macon being a private school when you got here? That was what you knew it would be like? Or did you, did it seem a little jarring after high school? Or do you remember your reaction to that? Or?
Well, I found that I think the most significant adjustment was the fact that this was an all-male institution.
Mm-hmm.
So not only was it primarily, almost exclusively white, but it was exclusively male.
Mm-hmm.
And I had some adjustments. Having grown up in a family with 2 older sisters, I was used to having females around.
Mm-hmm.
And my sisters were involved in lots of female activities and Girl Scouts and sports and things, and so it was hard for me to adjust to an all-male institution. And there were no African-American faculty at that point, in the administration. The only African-Americans that I came in contact with were the support staff in the dining hall and on the grounds and in the maintenance of the buildings. Those interactions were very positive, and I will say that in the summer of 1969, between my junior and senior year of high school, I worked on a project through the United Methodist Church in the Virginia Conference, and I worked in the Fulton neighborhood of Richmond. I lived there and worked at a community center called Bethlehem Center. And it was really an eye-opener for me to immerse myself in a very historic community of African Americans who were economically and politically disenfranchised. So that had a pretty formative influence on me as a 17-year-old. So as I went to my senior year in high school, I came back to my last year of high school as a very different person. Mm-hmm. And then coming to Randolph-Macon, I had some adjustments, and it was a challenge to accommodate myself to what I saw as a very stratified social structure here in Ashland.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit about the impression you had of other students as far as race relations? I mean, you said your interactions with the African Americans on campus who were support staff was very positive, and I've heard that from many, many people. If you could talk a little bit about any particular relationship you'd like to talk about, but also the attitudes of your fellow students as much as you remember.
Well, one of the very positive things that that struck me, because Dennis Howard was 2 years ahead of me, he was very active in student leadership on campus, and the fact that he was, I think, student government president, and
his senior year,
in his senior year, so that would have been my sophomore year. I was elected president of my class in my freshman and sophomore years, and so I got to know Dennis. I worked with him, and I saw that as a very positive signal that the college, at least from the students' perspective, were moving in the right direction. And I thought that was very affirming, and at least for those students who were involved in campus affairs and campus leadership, that Dennis felt comfortable enough to do it, and that there was enough support that he could serve in that position. Now, I lived all 4 years in Star Hall, and which was an all-male dorm at the time, and Reggie Barley was in the dorm with me, I think all 4 years that I was there. And so Reggie and I saw each other every day for almost, I think, pretty much all 4 years. And he was also a political science major. Now, having said that, there was a natural tendency for some of the African American students to affiliate with each other, I think, as a support group, as to be able to be candid with each other and share their experiences and help figure that out for themselves, in the sense of trying to understand the dynamics that were going on campus. And in that regard, I really wasn't and didn't seek out to be part of that, because I recognized it at the time that was something that was important. And I think they even for a while had a historic fraternity, African American fraternity, that they had established here. I don't think it survived.
It didn't last very long, but I have a picture. Yeah, there's a picture there for a few years in the yearbook.
Right.
And many of the African American students, alums that I've interviewed, all do speak of very fondly of having a meal together at the end of the day. And I think that they that was, as you say, a support. But I think definitely an intentional support system in place there.
These were very, very difficult times across the country for students at that point. The vanguard of student protests in universities and colleges that were in the North or in the West that were different from Randolph-Macon really occurred, let's say, between 68 and 71. And what happened here was kind of, I don't want to say it was an echo response, but it was more localized. It was slightly different. But there were things that did occur nationally that affected life here on campus. And one that comes to mind is in 1972, I think it was during the primaries for the Democratic presidential race, that George Wallace was shot in Maryland. And I do remember that students, both white liberal students as well as African American students, had some, probably in retrospect, inappropriate responses of saying they were, glad that he was out of the race, and he got what he deserved, and those kinds of strident responses that had an immediacy. You look at it in retrospect now, after 40 years later, it takes on a different perspective. And then, of course, there was the war, and the apex of that really occurred on campus here in May of 1970. The war was still an issue. People were still concerned about staying in school, so not being drafted and going into combat. However, the Nixon administration began their lottery system. In fact, Curtis Tarr, who was the head of the the Selective Service Program under Nixon, his obituary is in the Washington Post this morning. Curtis Tarr actually came to Randolph-Macon my sophomore year and spoke here on campus.
Okay.
He was the director of the Selective Service and helped establish the lottery system, which replaced the deferment program. And we all know that there was a disproportionate number of young black males who were being drafted in the earlier years of the war and serving in the war, and that the deferment program disproportionately benefited middle-class white males.
Was there protest around his speaking? Do you remember?
You know, I was trying to reflect on that this morning. I don't believe that there was some moderate local press interest, but everybody was generally very polite to him. I was there, and there was quite a few questions. I will say that that reading his obituary this morning, he really was a quite learned person with a doctorate from Harvard, and had been the president of a small college prior to joining the Nixon administration. So he was comfortable being at a small institution. But I'll just leave it at that.
Well, thinking about that same time period, can you talk a bit about the response on campus of the students and when the college went co-ed? Because you were here then, and you said you were adjusting to all male. And
Randolph-Macon was, and I think that James Scanlon has corroborated this in his histories. Randolph-Macon really was at a very, very serious financial point in 1971, really in 1970-71. Student enrollment had dropped significantly. The college's endowment was probably around $4 million. They had engaged in some short-term borrowing to meet operating costs, and things were pretty precarious. And so in the fall of 1970, Luther Wright and the board established a commission on enrollment. You know that story. And when they established it, they asked that there be two students to serve on this board. The president of student government, who was Dave Carl, who was class of 71, and the president of the freshman class. It turned out to be me.
Oh, okay.
So here I was trying to adjust to being a student on campus, and within probably, I think the first meeting that we had was in October.
Oh, wow.
And we met rather frequently with a group of trustees who were serving on this board as well. And Frank Brown was on that board, in that group, Ed Ames and some others. And it became clear that the college needed to take a bold new approach to recruitment and positioning itself. Now, I saw it as more than just dollars and cents. I saw it as really ensuring that the college would be relevant vis-a-vis other institutions like Randolph-Macon. There's just no way that I saw Randolph-Macon being able to survive as an all-male institution. And quite frankly, I thought that some of the things that I experienced my freshman year were typical of a freshman, and some of them, I think, also were unique to Randolph-Macon. My freshman year was not a very positive experience, quite frankly, and mostly centering around this all-male atmosphere. And I was seriously considering going to another school. And when the college made this decision and announced this in January of 1971 that they were going to go co-ed, hugely influential in my decision to stay here.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was somewhat vested in it, having served on the Commission on Enrollment,
Sure.
and been part of that those confidential deliberations. That I was elected to be president of my sophomore class, so those kinds of things were compelling me to stay for another year.
Right.
And I think it was probably the most significant change in the life of this college, other than moving from Boydton to Ashland in 1866. Going co-ed has had more of a profound influence on the life of this school. Maybe other historians would see it differently, but I think that was probably the most significant decision in the life of the school in the 20th century.
Well, both of those moves were make or break decisions.
Well, and not only was it just for financial reasons, but it also, if you over the long term, you have students who would meet each other, fall in love, get married, have children, and then you didn't have divided loyalties within an alumnus's home. They both went to the same school, and my personal life is an example of that. My wife is also a graduate, and both of my children one daughter's graduated, and another he's going to be a junior this fall. So that, in the long term, was really one of the most significant changes, that it really created a unified alumni unit among many families. Not all alumni, of course, marry other Randolph-Macon people, but many do. So.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with faculty when you were a student? Who were some particular mentors or role models? You said you were a political science major. Can you talk about
Well, it was interesting. I started out as an English major and learned a great deal in my first 2 years from faculty such as Edgar McDonald and Richie Watson and Bill Gray. However, I realized that as you move into upper level courses, it wasn't just reading novels, but you had to understand different schools of literary criticism, and I realized that in viscerally what I really loved was politics, and I really loved the science of politics and studying it. So I went over to Fox Hall the first day of my junior year and said, what do I need to major in political science? I don't have any courses in political science. And Lee Solomon, who was a professor there at the time, along with Bruce Unger, said, well, this is what you need to do. And so I wound up taking all of my major courses from my junior year through my senior year, and just immersed myself in it. And I was never more fulfilled academically than those 2 years. I just absolutely loved it.
Oh, that's great.
And took most of my classes with Bruce Unger and Earl Kuntz. But I just found that those faculty members were great scholars. They had tremendous personal maturity as people. They were very tolerant of students, and yet they challenged us in many ways. And I found the political science majors to be, we were very different. There's lots of different personalities among the graduates in the political science department, different points of view politically, but we all had a real appreciation and respect for the scholarship of that department. I do remember in, I guess it was the spring of 73 or the fall of 72, I think it was the spring of 73, Bruce Unger was defending his dissertation at Tulane. And so he was working on his dissertation that fall, the preceding fall, and the lights would be on in Fox Hall at 2 a.m., and we all knew that he was crunching data and writing his paper. And there was one he had to, when he went down to defend it. He canceled class for one of those days, and we got word from Howard Davis confidentially that he had been awarded his PhD. So, and Bruce was a rather shy individual. He became less shy over the years, but in those early years, he loved teaching, but he didn't like to have attention brought to himself. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the very next class, we were all sitting there early waiting, and he walked in the room, and we just spontaneously stood up and gave him a standing ovation. Oh. And I could tell he was very touched by the students' admiration for him and his accomplishment. Mm-hmm. That was a special moment for me in the life of this school. So, and Bruce and I became close friends over the years after I got out of
He
college.
did keep up with so many of his students. I hear a lot of alums who come back and really had fond memories of him.
I will say one of the best, most enjoyable non-political science courses I took was it was a survey of American literature with Richie Watson, but it was one of the first co-ed classes that I had in the fall of '71, and I think it was the combination of Richie being young and full of new scholarship, and he could relate to students, and the fact that there were this fresh crop of females there. It was like I came back to the same campus, but it was a new school. There was a new spirit and a new vibrancy about things going on here. Now, things weren't perfect, but and there were some challenges for the school to keep moving in the right direction. But it was almost as if we had sort of psychologically turned a corner, and it was not without its. There were detractors, both alumni and among the faculty, but it was the right thing to do. My roommate, who was a year behind me, had took a class with a very. It was a math course, and the professor had been here for decades. And he said he went into his class the first day, and this is in the first day of class in September of '71.
Right, fall of '71. Right.
And this professor said, good morning. How are you this morning? Flowers are for picking, and young ladies are for going to college. Let us begin."
Wow.
So that was kind of a humor. My roommate, who wound up being the best man at my wedding, every once in a while we'll talk on the phone, and he'll just break out and he'll quote that.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That must have given a sense of excitement and a new day, like you say, a new day.
With respect to race relations, I did want to share with you another personal experience that I had that had some influence on my life. I believe it was spring of my sophomore year, and my room in Star Hall opened out to the backyard of what was then Hugh and Catherine Stevens' home. It's now the Neville House. And there was a sidewalk that went between the backyards and our building. And I had the window open, and I was sitting in my room studying, and it was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and I heard this voice at the window go, "Hello there, hi." And I look over, and there was this boy, African-American boy, about 9 years old. I said, "How are you?" And he's fine. And I said, "What?" And he just was very friendly, and I said, "What's your name?" He said, "It's Frankie." And I said, "Well, Frankie, it's nice to meet you." And he said, "I just live over there in the other side of the parking lot in the woods. I'm coming home from school." So we talked for a few minutes, and then he left. And then the next day he came by and said hi again. And he started coming by frequently. And we would go outside and we'd play, throw the ball around, or football or baseball or whatever. And then he came by with his sister and his brother, and then other guys in the dorm got to know him, and we became friends, and we started doing some things together. And so then and then I wrote to him a couple times over the summer just to say hello, sent him a birthday card because his birthday's in August. And then our junior year, he would come by frequently. And that Christmas, the guys in the dorm got together and we bought Christmas presents for him and his family. And by my senior year, we were quite good friends. And his picture is in my senior
Yes.
picture in the yearbook. Well, Frank Strauss, I went on to graduate school. I sort of kept in touch, and he got to know Bill Gibson because Bill's sons, Candler and Miles Gibson, were same age in school and with Frank, and all through high school. And then the Gibsons told me that Frank decided that he wanted to be a student at Randolph-Macon. And, of course, he came from very modest means here in Ashland. And so I would see Frank during the 1980s when he was on campus. I'd gotten married, and
He did come to Randolph.
he did come to Randolph-Macon. And through the generosity of a number of different groups, including the United Methodist Women at Duncan Memorial, he was able to graduate with a degree in history. And I see him occasionally. He's active at Duncan Memorial and lives in Richmond, and we've become lifelong friends.
That is wonderful. Did his family have any connection to the college that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Just
no.
he lived, but the college was between his home and school, and
Correct.
so he was
would
just
walk
walking
through the campus on his
Mhm.
way home. And he just happened to see me and walking by, and he happened to see me sitting at my desk in my dorm room with a window open. And his extroverted 9-year-old personality connected with me, and we've become lifelong friends.
Well, that's wonderful. Did you get to know his family at all?
Yes, I didn't know. I didn't think he had a father present in the home, but I did. His mother became aware that he had befriended these guys at the school, and I was a little concerned that she, as any mother might be, that what's that all about? So he invited me over to their home, and then she brought a platter of food over one day as a way of saying thanks, and so we had connected with his immediate family.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a lovely picture, your senior picture in the yearbook, and I was going to ask you, tell me about this picture, so I'm so glad you shared that story.
Well, I had a little more hair, and it was a little longer than it is today. Now it's shorter and thinner. But
well, did that open up any other connections? I mean, the college, I was going to say any other connections between the students and the Ashland community, because the college, just the nature of undergraduate life, it can be pretty insular from the town, and I wondered if that opened up any more connections between the students and Ashland folks.
Well, it helped me understand Ashland a little bit better. It gave me another insight into the school. There were some students who came here and they just came to the campus, and this was their campus experience. They graduated. And then others actually took more of an interest in what was going on around them. I do remember Walter Fauntleroy came to the school. He was one of the leaders in the civil rights movement. I think it was my junior year. And he had gone to seminary with Bill Gibson, and they had maintained a connection. So that's how Walter Fauntleroy came to Randolph-Macon. And I remember one thing he said was that he came down early and he drove around Ashland, and he parked his car and got out and walked around the Gandy School, which had been the black elementary school before integration. And he said, "I've noticed that there's some construction going on in Buckystown.
Yeah.
New sidewalks and curbs." and the building's being spruced up. And he said, this is happening all over the South. And he says, for better or for worse, the white dollar follows the white child. And I thought that was an interesting comment on, and this was a talk that Walter Fauntleroy gave in Blackwell Auditorium. And so I think it was an interesting observation for me.
Were there any other civil rights speakers or leaders or activities on campus that you recall the students being involved in or faculty bringing?
I remember experiencing as a freshman the aftermath of Muhammad Ali coming to Randolph-Macon.
So he came before you.
That was before I became a student. But the impact of that was still being mentioned by alumni and some faculty and administrators.
And I gather a lot of the reaction to that was because of his war stance.
Correct.
Anti-war stance, I should
Correct.
say. Yeah.
You know, it was a package thing. I think it was because he was taking a position against the war. It was also that he had embraced the Muslim faith, and this was primarily a Protestant Christian community, and he was African American. There was a whole lot of things that were going on there. But
I saw that the yearbook, your freshman year, was dedicated to Henry Lee, and wondered if you had any memories or particular.
I have lots of memories of Henry.
Now, I didn't say his last name because I don't want to mispronounce it.
Taliaferro?
That's what I've heard people say, Taliaferro, and I was going to say that, but someone said, "Oh, that's pronounced Talifer." So I didn't want to say it. That's
the way I pronounced it, but in here in Ashland they may have pronounced it the other way.
But anyway, I did want to include his full name for the record. So tell me, about.
Well, he was a larger-than-life personality. Loved this college and loved the students of this college, and they loved him back in measure for measure. And that picture is probably one of the most beautiful pictures I've seen of him. He had a college truck, and he would ride down Henry Street with his arm out the window and would say hello to every single person. Of course, if you're around the college at any time, as soon as exams are over and students are taking their things and putting them outside in the dumpsters or throwing them away, a lot of the things that students would get rid of were perfectly fine things. And Henry he was probably one of the first recyclers, one of the first people, and he wasn't doing it for environmental reasons, but he just saw something of value. And, people who grew up in the Depression would not want to see things thrown away. And so he would pick up things that were still usable, and I don't know where he would keep them. No one seemed to exactly know where, but they became known as Henry Lee Specials. And I can remember being in a dorm, and they'd say, "Oh, you got a little refrigerator here," and they'd say, "Yeah, that's a Henry Lee Special."
Nice.
Including my wife. But, or if you need an ironing board or a chair, Henry Lee, you happen to have a study lamp, and he said, "Oh, let me see what I can do."
Oh, nice.
And
That's great.
he would bring, he'd say, "Hey, I got that lamp for you."
Oh, that's wonderful.
So they became known as Henry Lee Specials.
That's good.
I will.
Go ahead.
I will tell you. You had asked me about Flavia
Yes.
Owen.
Oh, yes. Please do.
My freshman year, Bill Gibson approached me in November and said, "Would you like to work in the library? There is a position that's opening up in January, and if you are interested, you should go over and talk to the librarian, Mrs. Owen." So I went over and I came over here, and the college had a student position in the Methodist collection, and it was for 9 hours a week. And she said, you will do two things. You will answer letters from people who are doing genealogical research or working on local church histories here in Virginia. And this is all about the college's early years, and there's a lot of Virginia Methodism materials here. So I took the job, and it started a lifelong interest in Methodist church history, and then which led me to become, as an adult, more interested in American church history generally, and I've been reading about that ever since. But what was interesting is that the college library was configured differently then, and where I worked was right off of next to where Flavia's office was. So she and I became very close friends over the years, and very much so that even after I graduated, we spent a lot of time together. But I guess it was the fall of my senior year, they started building the Frank Brown Student Center. And I was a curious kid. When I was growing up, I would always sort of poke around, and I remember the building was under roof, but you could still walk in. There were no doors or windows yet. And so I went in one evening about 1 o'clock in the morning, and the foreman had a big table with all of the blueprints laid out for the whole site. And I had noticed a few months before that there had been some surveyors on the lawn of the library, and I'd had summer jobs in construction, so I knew what they were doing. I thought, well, why are they surveying over here on the lawn of the library? But I didn't think anything more about it. But I'm flipping through these blueprints because I was just curious as to what the building was going to look like. And here was a set of drawings on the site plan that included the landscaping, and it said new parking. And the plans had a parking lot across from the student center, and where the Warner Pavilion stands now. This was before the library was expanded in 1986, right. And so there was a lot of this big expansive lawn. If you look at there's a photograph on the cover of the 1968 alumni directory. There's a picnic out there on that lawn, and there were magnolia trees, and I thought, oh my gosh, look at this! They're going to put a parking lot right up next to the library.
Which was at that time the front door.
Correct. So the next morning I came in. It was kind of cold that day, and I went in and I said, Mrs. Owen, I need to talk with you. And she looks up from her desk, and I told her what I had experienced, and her whole demeanor changed. And she put out that filterless Camel cigarette in an ashtray, and she stood up, and she went over and she put on her wool coat, and I said, where are you going? And she said, I'm going across the hall. She said, if what you're telling me is true, I'm going over to Peel Hall right now, and I'm going to go see Don Reed, who was the treasurer of the college at that time. And I thought, oh my, what have I started? And I've never seen. She became the classic steel magnolia, and she stormed out of the library, and she came back, and I saw her later that afternoon, and she said, that was a wonderful thing you did to tell me this. She said, yes, indeed, those are the plans, and we just didn't know about it. Well, as it turns out, that the reason is that the town of Ashland had an ordinance that when you build a new building, there has to be a certain ratio of parking spaces to the square footage. And that was the ordinance, and the college was required to put that parking lot in there. And so I said to Flavia, well, really, the college, that new building is not going to generate any new traffic. It's just a consolidation of space from other buildings like the bookstore, and we tore down the campus exchange. So Flavia worked with the college to go back to the town council and get them to waive the requirements of that ordinance for the logic that I just described. And there was an article in the Herald Progress.
Oh.
College gets a waiver of requirement for parking lot abandoned, and plans for parking lot abandoned. And I would smile and say, well, I guess I had a little something to do with that.
Oh, that's great.
So,
And that was before there were the plans, as you said, to remodel and expand the library to its current
correct.
configuration.
This was the
Or it's
1961 library.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And that would have been right in its front door.
correct. And you would have had cars backing out onto Henry Street, which wouldn't have made a whole. It was diagonal parking, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I had one small part to play in helping preserve what I think is kind of an iconic part of the central campus of the college.
Well, speaking of Flavia Owen, can you talk about just her approach to running the library and being part of the faculty, her relationships with the staff?
She would spend several hours she was very disciplined and she had a routine, and she would spend 2 to 3 hours a day in the back of the library where the deliveries of new books would arrive. Mm-hmm. And she would open every single book, read through it, and she would flip through it. She would write the name of the faculty member who had either requested the book or who should know about the book. So there are thousands of books in the library with Flavia's handwriting and pencil, and it would say McIlwain
mm-hmm.
or Munyon
mm-hmm.
or Davis
mm-hmm.
and or Oliver,
mm-hmm.
and you would know that either that faculty member had ordered that book or had would want to know that
mm-hmm.
it had arrived. And so she really hand cultivated this collection and made sure that it did several things. One, met the high standards of scholarship that she had established. Two, met the needs of the students in terms of what courses were being taught and how it supported the curriculum of the different areas of the college, whether it was natural sciences, humanities, social sciences, whatever. And while she may have had her preferences, she was very fair in ensuring that the collection reflected all of the different areas of all of the mm-hmm. disciplines of the faculty, and she kept a balanced approach mm-hmm. in that collection. I didn't come to really appreciate that until I was almost out of college, but she knew everything that was in this library. Interestingly, I remember that when I started working in the Methodist room as a freshman, there was a young woman in her 30s, an African American woman who was responsible for dusting the shelves and cleaning the restrooms and emptying the waste paper mm-hmm. baskets and mm-hmm. keeping the reference table stocked with pencils mm-hmm. and things. And she was a very nice person. I don't remember her name, but
Joyce, and I'm not pulling up the last name right now, but I believe it's Joyce.
But Flavia became her mentor and helped.
Fran Grimes. Okay, all right. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
But Flavia became her mentor and helped change her duties and responsibilities, and it was really exciting to see her grow professionally in her new assignments here at the college. And I thought that was very commendable mm-hmm. of Flavia mm-hmm. to do that. So Flavia was a person of I think high personal standards, mm-hmm. high moral standards, but someone who was very sensitive to the world around her and the changing nature of the school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
She also had a very, very droll sense of humor, and it was kind of a rite of passage that my senior year she would ask me to go to lunch with her, and she loved to go to this restaurant out on Route 1. And Flavia had I don't know, it was like a 1954 black car. I don't know what the make and model of it was, but she'd been driving this car for like 25 years, and from her house on Howard Street over to the college. So it was a rite of passage for her to ask me to go to lunch with her, and so we'd sit at the counter, and she'd eat these southern string beans and have a Camel cigarette.
Oh, well, she really did, in her almost 40 years as librarian, really had an impact and built this, what is really a wonderful collection, the core, the skeleton. Well, fleshed out what was the skeleton, but she really was so fondly remembered and highly respected.
And yes, and if you look at a lot of Southern scholarship across the United States, both published by Randolph-Macon alumni as well as others who came to the college to do scholarship, there are many scores and scores of books that have prefaces that extend their appreciation to her for her support of them.
That's great. Well, you have 2 children. You mentioned one, your daughter is a graduate and your son is a rising junior. So as you've been connected to the college for a long time. As you look back on your time and your relationship with the college over 30, 40 years, and as we look forward to almost the 50th anniversary of the desegregation of the college, and we've passed over 40 years of coeducation, what do you see as the state of the college now, or in contrast to when you were here, and what do you see we're going, where we're headed?
Well, I think that the college's scholarship and its standards for scholarship have always stayed high. That's first and foremost. I think that while we've always had a tradition of particularly since the 1920s, we've always had a tradition of good scholarship here at the college. The faculty has never been better. We have a really very well-credentialed faculty. Secondly, I think the college, because of its emphasis upon teaching, that we look for good scholars, and if they publish, that's great. And we certainly like that, but we want them to be effective in the classroom, helping undergraduate students become the very best scholars that they can be. And I see that as a tradition that's continued from 1970 when I first arrived here, now 40-some years later. But what's interesting is the composite of our faculty is so different now. We have much more geographical diversity. They've come from all over the United States and either other parts of the world. Certainly there's more gender a balance between men and women on the faculty. With respect to students, I have noticed since my daughter arrived here that there's been in recent years a very intentional action on the part of the college to increase minority representation within the student body. And I told President Lindgren unsolicitedly at one time at a reception that this is a significant change, and I think it's a very positive change, but it's also one that requires the institution from the trustees all the way down to reprioritize, and it requires a reallocation of resources to support, from a financial aid perspective, a more diverse student population. And I think that's absolutely critical for the college to position itself for the next 50 years. If anything, our nation is going to be increasingly diverse, and Randolph-Macon needs to be part of that. And I commend the school for focusing on that and making that a priority. When my daughter graduated in 2012, that commencement exercise was extremely powerful, very emotional, not just for me as an alumnus and because my daughter was graduating, but I could tell there was that particular commencement with Yvonne speaking as a commencement speaker, and some of the other. I remember Buddy Allen received an honorary degree, and he had funded a minority scholarship. And one of the students who was graduating crossed the stage, and Buddy stood up, and they embraced each other. And if you know Buddy's background and where he came from over that 45-year period, for me that was a very powerful moment. And it reminded me that Randolph-Macon is a place that changes people's lives, and it changes people's lives not just while they're here as students, but it changes them. It calls them to be change agents for the rest of their lives.
That's a beautiful example of that. Thank you for mentioning that. That really is. And the incoming freshman, well, I should say this past year's freshman class, minority students, almost 30%, 29,
Right.
whatever percent. So I think the college has made that a priority, but I think you're right, rethinking priorities across the board, not just in admissions, but in
hiring of faculty.
Faculty is definitely a challenge, a growing edge for us. But in courses and curriculum and looking at all kinds of things.
That's an excellent observation, and it'll also affect what you see on the shelves of the library in terms of the subject matter of new books.
That's right.
But also I think that this goes beyond just African American representation, although given the college's history and its geography, that's a primary focus. That I would hope to see more Asians and more Middle Easterners and people from Eastern Europe, South America, Hispanics, because that's really what the makeup of the United States in the next 50 years. So.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming today and sharing with Macon Memories. I'd like to give you the last word if there's anything else you'd like to share about your experience as a student or just an alum, or any other final words. I'll let you close us out.
Well, I think I'll probably repeat what I said a moment ago, and that is that I think it's important for alumni to discover the privilege and the rewards that come with supporting their alma mater. Staying connected with their school helps everyone involved, because all colleges will say that they change lives, and they do, but there are some institutions that, because of their profile and who they are, bring students in at a certain level, and when they leave, the delta of change is even more significant. And Randolph-Macon is one of those institutions. And I would encourage alumni and students while they're here, and then especially after they graduate, to be part of this process, a lifelong journey of helping this institution change people's lives and position them to be effective leaders in society and to be better persons in the world.
Well, I can't top that, so thank you so much,
Thank
David
you.
Meyer, for being here with Macon Memories.
It's great to be here.